Next up, for our last presentation of the day, we have Claire-Marie Brisson with Identity, Place, and Invisibility in the Francophone North Atlantic.
Well, I feel like I have a lot of incredible people who came ahead of me, so I hope that I am not repeating too many of the great presentations that I saw today. But with sort of the academic title, Identity, Place, and Invisibility, I think that there's a lot that can be said about all three of those words, all three of those topics in all of your presentations, right? What is our identity? If you're Franco-American or Franco-American identifying, if you're Québécois or Québécoise identifying, what does it mean to be a part of this community and why? Secondly, where is our place? I'm not a New Englander. And yet, as I was sitting here watching all these incredible presentations, watching all these incredible slides, which of course I don't have, I was looking over to my left. In my periphery of my vision was this map. Now, if you're on Zoom, you can't see it, but there's a map on the wall, and it shows the region of Chaudière-Appalaches. And that's where my great-grandfather was born, one of 13 children, in the city of Saint-Fabien-du-Panier, close to Montmagny. I'm not from this region, and yet I feel so indebted to this region. I feel like my own identity is here in the shadows, in the peripheries of New England. And my family left the area, not to go to the mills, but to go to the other place, the Rust Belt, the auto industry, the area where other people were coming together and saying, we have to build something that brings people together. And that was the car. And so, from my perspective, Detroit, Détroit, the mouth of the river, comes at the intersection, at the interstice of Canada and the United States. Where I grew up, we don't call ourselves Franco-Americans. We call ourselves Canadiens. We are Canadians. And there was a blurry space with that border. And there continues to be a blurry space with that border to this day. I remember as a child growing up in Dearborn, Michigan, my parents would always say to me, when you are asked what your identity is, you're American, but you're also Canadian. You're Franco-American, but you're also French-Canadian. You're Italian, you're Irish. And it's all of these meetings of the minds, all of these wonderful mosaics that came together to make you here who you are today. As a child, that was a lot to carry with me. But I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan, which the second most spoken language is Arabic. The third most spoken language is Spanish. My neighbors spoke Russian. And across the street, they spoke Romanian. This is the mosaic that we have in this country, and we're privileged to have in North America. But it's something that a lot of fear has been instilled. Questions of that identity have caused us to fear, have caused us to question, what do we do with this and where do we go? Is focusing on identity something that is inherently neglecting other communities? It's a big question. Is by asking Franco-American questions or French-Canadian questions separating us needlessly? These are things that we have to balance as well, because we do realize there are other people on the periphery in North America whose stories are even worse. Slavery from the African-American experience, as an example, which can never be compared to the experience of Franco-Americans, for example. So when we think about the place, when we think about the space, and we think about the visibility of Franco-Americans, within New England, there's a lot. But outside of it, what does it mean to carry the community within yourself? And that's something I've had to do for many, many years. So let's go back to Detroit. Let's think about the landscape. When people think about Detroit, they think about the hand. They think about Detroit being right here on that border with Canada. They think about cars. They think about Motown. They think about all of these exciting things that are moving, the transit. 80% of Canada's GDP relies on that connection between Canada and the United States. And yet, what exists in the shadows? St. Anne's Church, the French-speaking church, the first church that was of the same proportions as the churches of Europe, built on the shores of the Detroit River, still stands in Detroit. still has French-speaking masses. But the community never came together in the same way that it did here. It did in small sections, small parts, in Windsor and Ontario, which of course is right across the border. But when I ask the question, what does it mean to have place? What does it mean to have an identity that is within a place? My brain is always kind of blurred. And there's this idea by Deleuze and Guattari, or two French intellectuals, of the rhizome. Now, if you think about the way a potato grows or the way roots grow, they don't choose where they go. They forage their way. They move as nature requires them to. They think about, where am I going to get the best water source? Where am I going to get all the things that I need, the nutrients, right? That's what happens with the Franco-Americans outside of Quebec, or outside of a place where there was an established identity. We really strove for what can really nourish me? What can nourish my family? What can nourish my community? And so those questions were at the fore in the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society in Windsor. How can we nourish ourselves here on the borderlands of Detroit and Canada? Who are we? Why are we here? We're building cars. We're building people's dreams. We're building suburbia. And yet, who are we? And it touches on the questions of socioeconomic privilege. It touches on the questions of voice, of place, of memory, of the archive. Where do we go from there? What do we do with that? And I remember very specifically in high school, I wrote my name down, and my teacher came up to me and she said, I've been wondering for a really long time, when did you move here from Paris? And I stopped. I was like, why do you specifically say Paris? And I mean, what's this conversation going to? What do you mean? And she said, well, your name is French. I said, well, I was born in Detroit. She said, really? I said, yeah. She said, well, what does that make you? I said, well, it makes me French Canadian. She said, but you're not Canadian. And I stopped and I sat there, and for the first time, somebody told me the identity that I thought I had, I wasn't. And that was a big question for me. And I remember that summer I went back to Quebec, where my family lived, and the other parts of my family, and I had these questions, and I said, well, am I Quebecoise? They said, no, you're the American. Second rejection. Second question of place and space. Second question of visibility. And so this really started to make me think. We didn't have the term Franco-American as prevalent in Michigan as in New England or even in Louisiana, right? We had the question of, well, my last name is Brisson. What does that mean, right? The blurriness. And so with some of the work I've been doing with my research, I've been looking at the question of the community. And communities, Benedict Anderson writes an incredible work called Imagined Communities. It can definitely feed into the idea of creating an imagined space, an imagined New England, right? So Benedict Anderson says, communities, he observes, bring together members who, quote, will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. I like that term communion, especially for the Franco-American experience. The image of their communion, whether or not you are a part of the Franco-Michigander experience, or the Franco-Mainer experience, or any of these experiences. There is a communion in the idea of, yes, this is the origin, this was the place, this is what happened, and this is where we are now. And that's the diaspora. This is evident today, and we've all come here together to reflect about this, to think about this. But my question is not, well, I was called out in my high school class because I was pretending to be French and I wasn't, and I went to my family in Quebec and was rejected as being Quebecoise. Who the heck am I? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, what do we do with that baggage? Because it's something we can all identify with, right? And we've become creative about it. We've created blogs. We've gone into video games and explored the environments. We've gone into archives. We bought things off of eBay, right? We've delved into the archive. We've made podcasts. I have as well, the North American Francophone podcast, where I try to bring the stories of Franco-American experience into English for those who've had that erasure. And the questions of the socioeconomic nature. What does it mean that we're still battling these things that exist to this day, that have existed for generations in perpetuity? Well, what I argue is we can resituate our conversations so that it gets us out of these silos. And a lot of my own research looks at the fact that we've really put ourselves and pegged ourselves onto our geographies so much that we're not looking at that communion as much as we could. And I urge all of you to think about your own experience here in Maine or in other parts of New England, and the way we can reach out and make people realize we're all over the place here in North America. Franco-American experience is borderless. It's the rhizome. It finds connections through the liquidity of memory, through that flow, the ebb and flow of memory that exists across the United States. If you look at, for example, the state of Oregon, it was founded by a Franco-American. A lot of us don't know that. But the history stretches from sea to sea. And that's an expression that both Canadians and Americans can identify with, from sea to shining sea. And yet, we often reflect on what is closest, nearest, and dearest to us. But I urge you to examine the possibilities of your research, the possibilities of your own experience on other terrains. So we can reflect on our own stories, we are, as a geography, but I urge us to call it something a little bit different. I urge us to call it the Francophone North Atlantic, the ebb and the flow from the Atlantic that comes through all of the waterways across North America, across borders, across all of the places that we have names for so specifically. Canada, we know what that is. The United States, we know what that is. Maine, we know what that is. Michigan. These are all entities that have been so siloed. What flow exists between these areas? What places of memory exist from somebody who grew up just north of Maine, but then moved westward? Because this is not my own experience only, my family's experience only. There are so many other experiences. Another interesting fact is that at this point, the flow continues. 37.5% growth in the province of Alberta alone from 2001 to 2016, with the number of French speakers increasing. And that flow is coming not just from Quebec, but it's coming from overseas, transatlantic Frenchness that is coming in, as you see here in Maine, to New England, and to other parts of North America. To think about the vigor and the excitement that can come from looking at the Francophone North Atlantic as not just situated in North America, but as a global phenomenon. The Francophone North Atlantic can also be used as a frame of analysis when you're considering your research if you decide to change your work from creative to research. It's an accessible frame of reference that you can use. It means that all of a sudden, the experiences that you see in France or in Senegal or anywhere else in the Francophone world can truly be compared and looked at not as separate, but as part of a continuing dialogue in the same language. And I urge us to look at that as well. This alternative allows also for other identities to emerge, other perspectives, other things that exist on the periphery at this point in our imaginary, in our stories, and in our histories. Because who would guess that Franco-Michigander is here in New England and can speak to you on the same types of topics, the same types of things that you're interested in, with such clarity and such continuity? It shows that there's something there, there's something more, and there's something that we can continue. And thank you all for your wonderful presentations and for your time. Of course, open for questions. Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
That was incredible. That was really intense. Wow. My question, I think, is looking historically at this idea of French Canadian identity as this identity that was inherently transnational, that was not anchored in any specific, at least state apparatus, that was not specifically tied to the province of Quebec as the sort of de facto French Canadian nation state we see today. How do you see sort of a resuscitation of that identity in this new way that you talk about? It's this strength of the North Atlantic. At the same time that since the White Revolution, the development of sort of provincial, but still kind of almost nationalist splintering of different Francophone groups throughout North America, between Franco-Americans, between Québécois, between Franco-Ontarians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That has now taken such precedence to the point that, like speaking to a Québécois, he suggested that Canadien français, although the term is almost like this strange, antiquated thing to call someone. And then Québécois becomes sort of like the default de facto identity that everyone else has to sort of negotiate to legitimize their own identities as well. Sorry, I'm rambling a little
No,
bit.
no.
But how do you see the vision that you're talking about and this interconnectedness that you're talking about interacting with that sort of current reality as well?
Thank you for that question. I see the terminology that we use, not just within the North American Francophone sphere, but all of the spheres, as being indebted to and a part of the trappings of nationalism, right? If you say you're French Canadian, there's something there that is imbued that is socio-political in nature, as versus saying Québécois, right? And this comes from, if we take a look at the term Québécois, this really catches on with René Lévesque in the 1960s. Before that, Canadien français was used a lot. And at that time, prior to the Quiet Revolution, as you're pointing to, the idea of a more rhizomatic, a more trans-provincial, a more transnational, if we will, idea of French Canadianness or Frenchness, of French and Franco-Americanness was alluded to even in the writings of Lionel Groulx, right? Who Lionel Groulx becomes this nationalist figure. But during the pre-war, during his writings in the interwar period, he says, I would love to see bridges built between those French Canadians, he calls them French Canadian Americans, in New England with the people who live in Canada. And he doesn't just focus on the French speakers in Quebec, which is a new phenomenon. That's a phenomenon of the 60s. So all of that, the history is complex. The history is sociopolitical in nature. And if we go into that rabbit hole, we'll just continue down and down and down. What I want to do is sort of resist the idea of the trappings of nationalism and say, if we truly want to look at a culture and a cultural term in the modern context, we need to realize what terminology did in the 20th century and move beyond the sort of confining, the closed idea of culture and open it and say, rather than looking in these small silos, what are the bridges that we can build? Not in the sense of bridging, creating nationalist framework, but to create cultural framework, to open up cultural understandings that don't exist now, or where the door is slammed shut in, say for example, in my case, when I was in Quebec. Oh, no, you're not part of this. You're not part of this, right? We need to open that because clearly there are discussions that need to be had with certain members, and we cannot say that the right answer is only the socio-political. There needs to be a cultural plane of conversation.
Yeah. Question for you. So, it's first of all, once again, excellent presentation. I can see the teacher hole. Like I was just like, I can see that's awesome. So very refreshing presentation. So, in order to ask my question, I have to just kind of provide some framework. So it's funny you mentioned all these things because what you said about being here in New England, but yet having a sense of appartenance. It's funny when I started learning a little bit more about my identity when I was in high school. Like if it was whatever was French related in North America, I just remember feeling that's my history. If it was in Louisiana, if it was in Quebec, if it was in Missouri, like Old Mines, Missouri, like the New England Franco-American story, I remember it was closer to me, and I had more of a, like a pull on it, if you will. But I always consider it my history, regardless where it was. And so another thing I mentioned is you're talking. It reminded me of Dean Lauder and Eric Woodall's La Chapelle Perdue that they wrote, and you were talking about all of us in silos and whatnot. And
yeah.
I thought that was really. So how did you have this coming to? Because obviously you're not just like, oh, this is how we have to do things. It's like a step by step when you're putting connections. So what was your journey in coming to this mentality, if you will?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah. So I originally started off as a scholar of semiotics, and so that basically looks at signs and symbols, and breaking down those signs and symbols in Nazi-occupied France. Ooh, completely different topic. But it showed me the point to which ideology is formed and can build. And so in my master's program, I was looking at that. And when I entered my PhD, I thought, well, I'm just going to continue on. And I actually thought I was going to do memory studies relating to the Shoah, the Holocaust, looking at narratives, looking at memory and voice and a vision. And one day I was sitting in a coffee shop in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I put my pen down. And I always write with a fountain pen. So putting a fountain pen down brusquely usually leaves some ink stains on your hand, which I did. I got some ink stains all over my hand, terrible. But I put my pen down really fast. And I was like, oh my gosh, memory, that's it. And that was all my brain could say was memory, that's it. I close my laptop, I close my journal, I run to the university, and I go to the library, I sit down in the library, and I have this aha moment. And I quite literally search anything that had to do with French Canadians, French Canadian memory, Franco-American memory. And I said, there is memory within me that I need to activate. There's memory within me, within the history, within the stories I heard about my own grandfather, who the only reason I'm in the United States is my grandfather helped translate for the American Army from French into English and German, and eventually worked covertly. There were a lot of stories, there were a lot of questions about all of this. And I believe it was in trying to understand other topics that the arc turned back to myself. And I said, I don't want to write something about myself. I don't want to write something about my community. I don't want to write, this feels very narcissistic. But I brought these ideas to my dissertation director, and she stops. She looks up at me and she says, you found your voice.
Wow.
Run with it.
Wow.
And I think that's what we've all done with all these trajectories that I've heard today, that I've seen today. You're finding your voice, run with it. But I think we can do so much more as a community collaboratively in exciting ways as we move forward, especially since this is a young Franco-American summit, right? What can we do? What can we bring forth for the next generations to learn from?
All right, I just one little thing. I guess I just something maybe. Let me just. I'm really fascinated by this idea of how we memorialize things and how we memorialize history. Particularly given that my background is in studying, essentially the brutal history between colonized Algeria and France, and how that particular history is memorialized in France specifically. And I'm wondering too, just as a path, like going forward, as you say, in a way to kind of Brisonize the conversation, is to also open it up to this idea of how we memorialize, how young Francos memorialize their history and how that lives on. And I guess I just wanted to say that as a really interesting potential avenue of conversation, and also for this idea of created urban landscapes around mill towns. Like how do we memorialize who we are, and where is that in the physical landscape, and where is that also in writing oral history and all that.
It's interesting to talk about memorials and talk about monuments, particularly
in this moment in history.
I mean, I was from Charlottesville, Virginia. This was the question that we had. These were the problems that arose in 2017 that I saw quite literally face to face.
Right.
If you ever want to dialogue about that, I'm open. Just not now. But the question of the memorial, of what is memorialized, how is it memorialized, and how is history remembered, and how do we remember history in the present? Because history is not only a past, it's also a continuation in the present. It's a voice in the present that you are bringing forward to the future. And every second that I'm speaking right now, the moment that I speak is already the past. So we also have to remember that the weight of history is still in the present. And sometimes false memorializations, or the way that we look at our history, is problematic. And so we always need to be cognizant that the self-reflectiveness of history needs to be present within the study of any culture, because culture is not final. Culture is a process.
I have feelings about
Well, thank you so much.